On a frigid November morning in 1966, deep in the Alaskan wilderness, a soldier carefully opens the box he was just handed. Inside it, a small metal sphere, just a little bit larger than the average tennis ball, rests. Despite the intense cold, he feels a nervous sweat beginning to form. He reaches down and picks the ball up, carefully sliding it into the artillery piece positioned right next to him. Despite the protective suit that he's wearing, he knows that if he drops the sphere, there's a good chance that the toxic cargo inside would work its way through the seams of his suit, dooming him to a terrible death. Inside this little metal ball was a sample of a somewhat obscure bacteria, which had been discovered a half-century earlier as an odd disease of squirrels. Researchers had soon found it to be quite deadly to humans, though. With the Cold War now in full swing, military leaders were desperate to test as many different pathogens as possible. For that reason, he had been ordered out to the cold Alaskan wilderness to test out a sample of this bacteria, Francisella tularensis, the causative agent for what is now known as tularemia. As he ducks down and prepares for the artillery piece to fire, he says a quick prayer to himself and hopes that wherever the sphere lands, it's far enough away that he will be safe from the invisible microbe. So, what exactly is tularemia? Also known as rabbit fever, it's a rare disease caused by a bacteria, Francisella tularensis. It is most commonly transmitted by ticks or deer flies, spread whenever humans handle infected animals. Originally, it was thought to be a disease of squirrels, but it is now known to infect a variety of mammals, most commonly rabbits. For this reason, it's classically associated with hunters, although in a particularly famous series of cases at Martha's Vineyard, which we will dive into later in the episode, several people fell ill when infected material from rabbits was aerosolized by a lawnmower. Once the bacteria finds its way into a human host, it grows and multiplies for anywhere between only a day to up to 2 weeks. Once it hits a critical mass in its victim, it explodes into a devastating illness, closely resembling the bubonic plague. It has 6 possible clinical variations, but the most common, called the ulceroglandular form, is exhibited by 3/4 of those infected. It starts with vague symptoms: fever, chills, headache, lethargy, not uncommon from a regular flu. As the bacteria spreads across the body, it enters the lymph nodes, causing them to painfully swell until they ultimately burst open, releasing bacteria-filled pus into the environment. If the patient survives, they'll be left with large scars in these areas as a reminder of their ordeal. In the end, up to half of all people infected will ultimately die of this disease. So why exactly did the US government decide to test this microbe as a possible biological weapon? First, it's relatively easy to aerosolize, allowing it to be quickly spread across an enemy position. Second, it is highly infective, meaning enemies only have to inhale a tiny amount of the aerosol, as little as 10 bacteria, to fall ill. Third, it's fast-acting, typically incapacitating opponents in as little as 1 to 3 days. But these are not particularly unique to tularemia. Even at the time, there were dozens of other pathogens that could achieve these things. The big difference for tularemia was that it was thought to be surprisingly safer than other available agents, such as anthrax or ricin. Hey, everything is relative, right? With appropriate medical therapy, mortality can be less than 10%. Plus, tularemia requires a host to survive and will remain viable on surfaces or in the air for only a short period of time, meaning that affected areas would be relatively safe just a few days to weeks after a weapon had been deployed. Knowing this, the plan would likely have been to load several hundred of these small spheres containing tularemia into a tactical rocket, most likely the MGM-29 Sergeant. In a ground war against the Soviets, these rockets could have been deployed in areas where the use of a more deadly biological or chemical agent, such as anthrax or sarin, would be intolerable, such as on military formations that were situated in or near large civilian areas. The Americans were not, however, the first to consider this agent as a military weapon. While information on biological and chemical weapons from the Soviet Union is quite scarce and at times unreliable, one Soviet scientist, Ken Abelic, who defected to the United States in 1992, claimed that the Soviets used tularemia for a crude form of biological warfare during World War II. At the time, the Axis powers were tearing through the Soviet Union in the largest invasion of all time, Operation Barbarossa. Soviet leaders, desperate for anything that could slow their enemies down, decided to try out experimental rat weapons, developed by the scientists to deliver their lethal illness to the enemy. They had originally planned to infect the rats with bubonic plague, but feared that the inevitable outbreak in their own territory would not be controllable after the Axis forces had been defeated. Instead, they opted to use bubonic plague's slightly milder cousin, tularemia. They first deployed this weapon at the Battle of Stalingrad, where they released hordes of infected rats into enemy lines. Purportedly, this worked to great effect, with up to half of captured German soldiers exhibiting symptoms of the disease. Unfortunately, though, as had happened in many early attempts at biological warfare, the pathogen flew right back into the Soviets' faces when the rats scurried back into Soviet barracks, sickening their own soldiers as well as their enemies. Thankfully, except for this one partially successful attempt, tularemia was never deployed again as a weapon. So where exactly did this little pathogen come from? It's suspected to have been with humanity since at least the 14th century BC, when the disease struck the Hittite Empire in modern-day Turkey and Syria. It can be quite hard to distinguish tularemia, though, from the more common bubonic plague, which ravaged much of the world over the millennia. When plagues are mentioned in ancient texts, usually the author is referring to the bubonic plague, also known at times as the Black Death. This outbreak, however, was somewhat different. The king Mursili II wrote prayers seeking relief from a plague that had killed scores of his people for decades, and had actually been what had killed both of the kings who preceded him. While what he described had symptoms of bubonic plague, that disease typically strikes quickly, ravaging a city over the course of months to a few years before rapidly fading away. A plague-like disease that persists for decades, however, is potentially tularemia. It's hard to tell where exactly the Hittites had contracted this disease, though. Most likely, it was spread by animals that they had captured as spoils of war, although the Hittites themselves believed the disease was spread to them from Egyptian slaves. A message written by the ruler of Eleusia in modern-day Cyprus to the Pharaoh of Egypt describes a disease ravaging his people before the Hittite outbreak. In this message, he names the disease the Hand of Negral, after the Mesopotamian god of war, death, and disease. While in previous episodes, we had traced the disease from ancient times up to its modern discovery, this time, we have no good record of the disease and its spread. It so closely resembles bubonic plague that it's likely that many outbreaks of the plague were in fact tularemia, but it's impossible to know for sure. For that reason, we are forced to fast forward several thousand years to the turn of the century in America. Over the centuries, bubonic plague had been a constant pestilence to humanity, but occasionally had exploded into pandemics, killing huge portions of the population. The first two pandemics were known as the Plague of Justinian and the Black Death, respectively. In 1894, it appeared that a third pandemic was in full swing, situated primarily in Asia. Due to extensive trade between Asia and the Americas, United States officials were desperate to prevent the disease from spreading into their country. In 1899, it was first reported in several South American countries, worrying these officials. Despite their best efforts, though, the disease was spread through trade routes into the U.S. ports, and the first cases were inevitably spotted in San Francisco in the following year, 1900. The disease rapidly spread into local wildlife, necessitating aggressive monitoring by American researchers. In 1903, an outbreak of what appeared to be plague nearly annihilated a population of squirrels just east of San Francisco. Over the next few years, several more outbreaks would occur in squirrels, as well as hunters who ate them. In 1909, however, a physician by the name of George McCoy became interested in these squirrel outbreaks. Over the next 3 years, he identified hundreds of squirrels in California that had died of what was supposedly the plague. In most, he was able to successfully identify Yersinia pestis, the causative agent of bubonic plague. But several dozen of the animals did not appear to be infected with that bacteria. After a great deal of work, however, he would successfully identify a new bacteria in these squirrels, which he would name Bacterium tularensis, later named Francisella tularensis, after the Tulare County in California, where it was discovered. At the time, this was considered to be a fairly obscure pathogen, and not much further thought was given to this rare variant of the plague. In 1919, however, after an outbreak of an unusual plague-like disease in a rural Utah community, the US government dispatched Dr. Edward Francis to investigate. It did not take him long to uncover the new bacteria as a causative agent in several infected patients. When the first of these patients died, he performed an autopsy and confirmed that new bacteria to be the cause of death. Somewhat disgustingly, however, he had developed a habit of performing his autopsies barehanded, without any protective equipment. Naturally, he fell ill with the disease 5 days later. He spent weeks in the hospital and was unable to work for several months afterwards due to the severity of his illness. But, fortunately, he survived. Soon, though, he returned to his work, apparently now feeling that he was immune and having seemingly learned absolutely nothing from the episode. He performed thousands more autopsies on both humans and wild animals alike, still with zero protective equipment. Over the next several years, he fell ill 4 more times, although now with a somewhat milder illness, and with ulcerations confined only to his hands and his arms. Each time, he, being the good scientist he is, cultured his own pus-filled ulcers and identified tularemia as the causative agent. Seemingly not content with his own callous behavior towards the pathogen, he fostered a culture of laxity with biohazard safety in his laboratory, and all 5 of his assistants fell seriously ill with the disease at least once. Fortunately, nobody died, although all of the assistants required at least several weeks of hospitalization and recovery before they were able to return to their work. Back in Washington, D.C., a meat merchant came down with a febrile disease, which caused ulcerations and lymphatic swelling under his armpits. His doctors referred him to Dr. Francis, who was quite alarmed to hear that the merchant was quite familiar with the disease and had diagnosed himself with what he called rabbit fever, a disease which had apparently become quite well known in his specific trade. In an experiment, Dr. Francis purchased almost 1,000 rabbit livers from that man, sourced from all over the country. Disturbingly, he found tularemia in several, indicating that the disease had spread across the entirety of the United States. Over the next several decades, thousands of cases were reported across the country. Fortunately, it appeared that it could not be spread from person to person and occurred almost exclusively in hunters or in those with some large exposure to wild animals, typically rabbits. In a bit of an exoneration for Dr. Francis and his somewhat callous disregard for laboratory safety, many, if not most, of the other researchers at the time, even those who took extensive preventative precautions, also wound up contracting the disease after working with infected animals, indicating the pathogen's extreme virulence, given the right conditions. By the 1940s, 6 major presentations of the disease were recognized. Ulceroglandular, the type which produces severely enlarged, purulent lymph nodes and closely resembling bubonic plague, was overwhelmingly the most common. A second form, oculoglandular, had occurred when bacteria was introduced directly into the eyes and produced a large, swollen eyelid, as well as a bloodshot, ulcerated eye, and swollen lymph nodes on the head and neck. Other types included glandular, which was identical to ulceroglandular, but without the leaking lymph node, typhoidal, which produced a flu-like illness, oropharyngeal, which caused a disease isolated to the mouth and throat, as well as a severe pneumonia form. Now that the disease had been well described, though, and that the pathogen had been isolated, what could be done for those who fell ill? The first effective treatment, which impressively came before the antibiotic era, was produced by Dr. Lee Fauché, who extracted antibodies from the infected animals and administered them to sick humans in 1932. It was surprisingly effective, substantially shortening the duration of the afflicted's illness. It did, however, produce an autoimmune condition known as serum sickness in half of all of those who were treated. Alarmingly, 16% of patients had a reaction so severe that it was worse than the tularemia itself likely would have been. Fortunately, though, streptomycin was discovered in 1943 and soon found to be highly effective against tularemia, although it had to be injected by a healthcare professional twice daily for several weeks. This was just one of the many reasons why it was thought to be such a great biological weapon, and it would incapacitate soldiers without killing them and require large amounts of medical personnel to treat the disease. This, however, is where our story takes a dark turn. In that same year, 1943, the U.S. Army established its Center for Biological Warfare in Fort Detrick, where it began testing on a number of infectious agents, including tularemia. In yet another morbidly impressive show of tularemia's virulence, over 100 laboratory personnel wound up developing tularemia over the next decade from accidental exposures. Disturbingly, many of these cases were caused by strains which had been specifically engineered to be resistant to streptomycin. By 1955, the Department of Defense felt the need to progress to human testing to combat Soviet developments in biological weaponry. They tested injections of the pathogen on several supposedly volunteer prisoners at the Ohio State Penitentiary, who all fell ill with the disease. After they recovered, the scientists again injected these same prisoners several months later. Once again, all of the prisoners developed the disease, albeit this time in a slightly milder form, confirming that a first infection caused at least a partial immunity to the disease. Several studies were also undertaken on military groups who were usually conscientious objectors, or people who had been drafted into the army but refused to fight based on either their personal beliefs or religion. These recruits were then exposed to the bacteria in a variety of ways. The researchers even developed a special spherical chamber known as the 8-ball, where they could test a number of different bacterial deployment methods on human subjects. Fortunately, all of these test subjects were provided with adequate medical care afterwards and amazingly survived their ordeal. Other tests also included airdrops and artillery shellings of the pathogen on large swaths of uninhabited land to determine how long the disease could survive in the environment. Thankfully, in 1970, Richard Nixon ended the development of any further biological weapons in the United States. Just 2 years later, over 100 countries signed a treaty banning the development or stockpiling of biological weapons. Allegedly, though, the Soviet Union continued their investigation anyway, developing and testing a strain of tularemia that was resistant to both antibiotics and vaccination, although the information on this is quite scarce. So, where exactly does that leave us today? Tularemia, like the bubonic plague, still occurs sporadically around the country, as both of these diseases are carried in a wide variety of wildlife species. Because of this, they are next to impossible to completely eradicate. Tularemia sickens several hundred Americans each year, with almost half of cases occurring in 3 states: Arkansas, Missouri, and Oklahoma. Almost exclusively, these are hunters or other workers who have come close to wild mammals, although occasionally outbreaks amongst laboratory workers have also been reported. A notable exception to this, however, occurred in the summer of 2000 in Martha's Vineyard, Massachusetts. Over the course of 4 months, 15 adults had fallen ill with the disease, with only one of them having any known contact with a wild animal. Naturally, an investigation was undertaken and eventually found out that nearly all of the people who had contracted the disease had mowed their lawn in the days prior to falling ill. As it turned out, cottontail rabbits had been introduced to the area 70 years earlier by game clubs. These rabbits were sourced from, of course, Arkansas and Missouri. These rabbits are present throughout the area and often will run across people's yards, occasionally leaving behind little tufts of hair containing the lethal pathogen. When unsuspecting citizens ran over these little tufts of hair with their lawnmowers, they inadvertently released the pathogen into the air, spreading the disease. Interestingly, this was not the first outbreak in Martha's Vineyard either. 22 years earlier, 7 people had fallen ill after a wet dog, who had presumably rolled in grass containing rabbit hair, shook himself dry after coming inside, sickening every single person in the house at that time. Fortunately, tularemia is now quite a rare disease, but it is still one that has to be considered in anyone exposed to wild animals who suddenly falls ill. While we no longer need to fear a biological attack with tularemia, it's important to remember that there are many pathogens, such as this one, hiding in the wild, waiting for their chance to strike again.